is how can we find a more common force majeure clause that can be highly accepted in the industry? It seems like this is the clause that takes the longest to resolve.
Well, just call me and ask me and I'll give it to you. Barbara and I are not ever going to give you a standard clause in one of these presentations because we both have clients to represent and every situation is unique. And a lot of lessons have been learned in the industry since this happened. It used to be common to have epidemic and force majeure clauses. You're not going to see that anymore because we all know that we're in the middle of an epidemic right now and it's not preventing meetings. So hotels are going to be tighter and tighter on these force majeure clauses. So you're going to have to negotiate on a case-by-case basis. And I know you hate hearing that, but you're going to have to negotiate on a case-by-case basis based on the value of your event and how badly the hotel wants to book that business. Barbara, what do you think?
I agree, Lisa, and I go back to what I'd said at the outset is, we're not going to give a standard, this is the best in class clause, but what we will tell you is what components to look for. And from the group's perspective, a couple things. One, the grocery list, right? The grocery list of bad things. And forever and ever, I've always said, there's typically the catch-all statement, beginning or the end of the list, or any other cause beyond the party's control, something along that line. What I'm seeing now, both on hotels and convention center contracts, is the list. If any of the following happen, and there are 10 things listed, there's no catch-all. That's it. That's the list. Icelandic volcano happens, who cares? It's not on the list. So I think that, honestly, I think that does a disservice to both sides in not having that. And certainly it's something on the group side. I'd fight to have a bit of a catch-all because who are we to predict what should be on that list, right? That said, you got to look at that component. Second component, always the most important, that standard of impact. We've gone round and round, commercially impracticable, impossible, illegal, a certain percentage of attendees, prevented from coming, can't come, you name it, everything in between. Again, I go back to what I said a few minutes ago, which is maybe not if, but when you're on the spot to say this clause applies from the group side, you've got to be able to establish it. And so if for the group's perspective, using a percentage approach is better for the group, then use a percentage approach. If it's better for the group to use commercially impracticable, use that approach. But be clear on what that requirement is and how you're going to establish that requirement. And again, expect that if you're going to go out of the gate with a percentage and you want to go out of the gate with 20%, you expect that it's going to come back with a high percent coming back that's impacted. And you might spend a lot of time and effort negotiating it. But remember, checking your blind spots. Have you looked at the cancellation fee clause? Maybe if you had to cancel, if epidemic isn't on there and you need to cancel, have you looked at just exercising your right to and write a check if need be? That's again something you'd look for. So that's why certainly every client, every contract is different. Certainly every client and timing is different. One thing that was important and will be important is the fact that if a force majeure applies, if the group wants to have the meeting anyway, there'd be offset on room attrition, food and beverage minimum. That was something we would always just assume would be the case. As Lisa mentioned earlier, the some business is better than no business. But I think it is important to articulate it in the contract and make sure it's clear on that point that you have that in there, because that's what you're going to use to impact it. And look, there's a lot of other flavors and variations that could go into that clause. There are things like, if these bad things, something on the grocery list happens within a certain time frame of your meeting, I've certainly seen that strategy as a way to fence it in. While that might work for some force majeure events, it might not work for others or all of them. So I do get concerned that we're drafting to this one circumstance, and in doing so, we're losing sight of really what this clause has done forever and ever, which is to be that catch-all, to hopefully be something that we don't focus on after this. Don't forget about, don't focus so much on that you're kind of losing those blind spots. Remember the basics, remember those two requirements. And Lisa, I know we've said this obviously prior to COVID, how important it is to really differentiate and delineate. And yet when I read clauses, I often see mixing of these terms. I see mixing of where the standard of impact is, and that doesn't do either party a good service.
let me talk about this from a different perspective rather than just from the clause. And I hate to talk about the Supreme Court right now, but the Supreme Court has a decision on pornography that says it's difficult to define, but I know it when I see it. And the same is really true with force majeure, or it used to be. If there's an Icelandic volcano eruption that shuts down international travel, who would have thunk it? And yet I had many hotels that let people out of their events because we all agreed, yep, you can't have this event because nobody can come here. So when it really happens, everybody they don't look at the clause. They're like, yes, it's obvious you can't do this. The problem that we've had in the last 6 months is that a customer will send a letter, sometimes a week or less before the event, and say, there's a force majeure, we can't come. And the hotel says, what do you mean you can't come? Of course you can come. Everything's fine. And so it's not so cut and dried. So as Barbara and I have talked about in other presentations, instead of sending that letter saying we're out, contact the hotel and say, here's our concerns. Hotels are not agreeing to the clause that says if there's a force majeure, but we have the event anyway, we can reduce our commitment. And I'll tell you why they're not, because it has caused so many disputes in the last 6 months. Customer had 800 reservations booked, and a week before the event, they said, we're claiming force majeure, only 10 people are going to show up and we're going to do our meeting remotely. And they refused to pay attrition, and the hotel says, that clause that allows you to reduce doesn't apply because there's no force majeure. And now we're in a big dispute. So instead of just taking those hardline positions, come to the hotel and say, here's what we're worried about. What can we do? And you're going to get a very different response than if you send that letter saying, we're out, we don't owe you anything. And especially going forward, that's going to be something that's really going to need to happen.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in on one other point on that, Lisa, that, with the emergence of the variants and the way that they crept up, August, September last year and December, January or so of this year, those really were emergent. So the groups that had these so-called short-term cancellations, so maybe notifications 6 weeks or less out of the meeting, that really was a dumpster fire in that way. And the reason I say that is what I think it shows on the group side is that these groups were holding out as long as possible to make a decision. And that was exactly what the hotels had asked them to do. Now, I absolutely agree with you that this should be a conversation, not a pop-up confrontation, with the notice. But, I do think that that's, part of that process. Let's hope that doesn't happen again. I agree with you that in most instances it would be apparent. But I think the fact that, that happened isn't necessarily on the groups. In fact, I think the groups should be thought of better that they did that because, of course, a year or two ago, we heard 6 months out is too early to cancel. So, those push and pull, still remain. But all that said is, the other thing I'll say, and, I've talked about this as well, Lisa, I don't think it does a service to say, well, it's not a force majeure because the hotel's open, the lights are on. That doesn't mean that this particular group in the contract that they negotiated a standard that just said if the lights are on, you have to come. So, I do think I'm hoping, honestly, that we're past all that. I feel that we are, but I do think that those are things which we're all dealing with on the back end of it in wanting to go overboard in addressing some of this clause, which, again, you and I agree, I think on that doesn't need to happen. It just needs to have the basics. And I think that to me is the most important thing. And, hope for the best, right? Plan for the worst.
So all of you who've been on these presentations in the past know Barb and I are really good friends. But here's one where we've kind of disagreed, and we've got several cases going over this very issue. So both of us have points to be made here. So we just need you to understand that